Vakamarama. And I also wish, on behalf of the Soqosoqo Vakamarama, to thank your organization for showing an interest in what we do. And this next 3 days is a progressive exercise for the Soqosoqo Vakamarama, and it will definitely take us forward. And I'm looking at the program given to me by your officials, and I'm very impressed, and I think we will gain a lot from the next 3 days. And we also wish to thank you as an indigenous person for showing an interest, because this is the only indigenous, not just women, indigenous group that's registered by law in the country. And it's a matter of importance to all indigenous people, because we believe we are the group that can advance and push forward matters of indigenous interest. And I think it is timely that we should be concentrating in these next 3 days in finding out from the women who are members of the Soqosoqo Vakamarama. We have the 14 provinces represented here, to find out from them exactly their views on their capacity in regards to their provincial setup and in regards to the national setup. So I look forward to an excellent and brilliant outcome, because I know you have a brilliant set of officials whom I have been having discussions with. And once again, thank you. And I hope, the small ceremony of Sebu, probably inadequate for your status, but that is what we are able to provide for you this morning. And we honor you for coming today. Thank you.
So thank you again for the warm welcome this morning. It is unexpected from the perspective of we're so used to going into meeting places where there is an opening address and then we get on with the work. So I want to acknowledge on behalf of my colleagues who are here this morning, this is a learning curve. So today we are here to learn from you, if I can just say that right at the outset. I also want to, I had a prepared speech, but I probably should just throw it away because it doesn't do justice to the day that we have here today. But before I move along, I just want to, Andifina, thank you very much for inviting us to be here today. Leading an international organization, it's only possible for me and my colleagues to be here today is because of where we've come from. So today is a good time for us to listen, and thank you for giving us that opportunity to be here. So to the Executive Council of the Soqosoqo Vakamarama, and I know that there are young women from the provinces here, thank you for this opportunity to be here for 3 days to work together with you. So when, for the next 3 days, or rather for the opening remarks, Andifina asked me to speak about 2 key points. The first one is, what does self-determination mean for an INGO? And number 2, why is it critical for INGOs to support traditional women's organizations? And I think those 2 questions for me is really a question to INGOs, to face the key question, which is, what are you doing with your power? What are you doing with your privilege? What are you doing for Pacific Islanders? What are you doing for Fijian women? What are you doing for Indigenous women? What are you doing for young people? So that's the question that I heard when Auntie Finau put forward. What does it mean for an INGO to address self-determination? Today, Oxfam in the Pacific is 5 years old. On the 1st of September 2015, I walked into the Pacific Leadership Program office at Flagstaff. So it's a pivotal milestone for us as an organization. I think 5 years ago, if somebody had told me I'd be working closely, or Oxfam would be working closely with Soqosoqo Vakamarama, I would have said, oh, I'm not sure we're ready for that. And I think in terms of readiness, we're as ready as we can be, but we also recognize the journey that lies there ahead of us. So this morning I want to reflect on what the last 5 years has meant for us as an INGO, and what it means for an INGO to be located in the Pacific. Today, to be in the Pacific, climate change is at the center. But when we talk about climate change, a lot of us don't really, we think of the images on TVs about rising sea levels. I'm sorry, I'm speaking in English, but I hope I make sense. It's about rising sea levels, and for us in Fiji, rising sea levels is, we tend to think of it like, oh, we have to build new seawalls, we need to move away from coastal areas. But there are some countries that are in the Pacific where moving inland is not an option. I'm talking about Tuvalu, I'm talking about Kiribati, talking about Niue, Marshall Islands. So, and climate change, when we look at climate change at the international level, they always use the images from the Pacific to talk about climate change and talk about how there's no plan B. And yet for too long, we've had others speak for the Pacific. So what does that mean for us as Fijians living in the Pacific? Does that mean that we just take care of ourselves as Fijians? Or do we also look out to what's happening in Tuvalu, in Kiribati? Self-determination is not just about independence. Self-determination is not just about membership. Self-determination, independence is not just your registered organization. We're a registered Pacific NGO. So for us, the registration, being a registered Pacific NGO, has meant that we have to talk about, we have to use that independence that we have to use it responsibly. So the challenge has come back to me as a Fijian, as the head of an international NGO, to say if you want to speak about climate change, then you've got to have Tuvalu, Kiribati, RMI, Marshall Islands at the forefront. So what does that mean for us today? For the next 3 days, we are going to look at we're going to talk a lot about our organization, the kinds of ways we make decisions, the way in which we want to ensure that we are run in a way that where decision making allows for other voices to come in. In the place where we work, we talk about it as accountability. But our accountability is not just to that piece of paper. The accountability is not just to the charitable trust. But really it's about our membership as part of this region and what are we doing about climate change. So I want to recast the conversation for this next 3 days. It is about Indigenous women articulating, talking about the future that you have, but how is it that we not only think of ourselves, but think about those who don't have. And that's been the same journey we've had as an INGO. We have had to really look within ourselves to say that it's not an INGO that does the work, it's really about others and how do we make that happen. So we're very grateful. Thank you again, Mandifina, for giving us the space to be here. Because what has enabled us to be here today is that we've been brought up to not just think of ourselves, but to always think of the future. That's a really core part of addressing climate change. It is about stewardship. It is about custodianship. INGOs are known for all their resources, the money, but that's in a world where money is the centrality of what gives it power. But what we have been saying, what we want to bring to the table at the global level is that in the Pacific, we own our resources, but we make decisions not for ourselves individually, but for the future. And that the international development frameworks don't recognize that. So the way in which we've been challenging ourselves, the way in which we've said, are we ready to give up our power? Are we ready to give up power is about recognizing that every Fijian person, including every Fijian woman, owns land, owns other resources, but it's never been ours to own for our own use, for profit. It's always for the future. Just that comment is a challenge to INGOs. The challenge is there are other sources of wealth that exists. And that's what this next 3 days is about. The self-determination is around that there are other assets. There are assets that lie within us that'll make a difference. It's not, money is one. Money is the currency, but there are other currencies that matter. The relationships, where I'm from, the traditional relationships that exist, the way in which we access land, the sea. Those are all places of power. And for the next 3 days, we are given the opportunity to talk about that, but to talk about it in a way that we recognize that there is a decision-making line, but how do we make decisions so that we bring other voices to the table? So for us as an INGO working on self-determination, we want to ensure that we're not just talking about, as an INGO working on self-determination, it's about recognizing that there are other perspectives, there are Indigenous women sitting in the room, and that your perspective, your view, the way in which you see resources matters. So for the next 3 days, when we look at our structure, don't just think about it as a structure, don't just think about it as a charitable trust act, tick the box. It's really about us as Indigenous women making sense of how do we ensure that there's a different type of way of looking at the economy. That what would the decisions that we are making also matter for other Pacific Island countries. there are also indigenous women that sit in Kiribati, in Tuvalu, in RMI. And that's what we do as an INGO, is listen to what it is that you are saying. So the critical, and the second question you had asked me to reflect on, was around why is it critical for an INGO to support a traditional women's organization? I'm going to, replace traditional with indigenous. I think it's really important for us today to talk about what does it mean to be an indigenous Taukei woman, and for us to talk about what are the key systems that exist, what are the institutions that exist. Because from an INGO perspective, that's how one of the areas that we look at is understanding the systems and institutions that enable better decision making. So at the end of the 3 days, and also for the future what I see, this is not just a 3-day workshop, but rather a place where we get to continue to listen. The learning is really on our side. The learning is for us, we understand, at least from where we are working, we understand that there are institutions, that there are systems of decision making, and we want to understand how is that done in a way that sits comfortably with international frameworks like the human rights framework. We have to think about how is it possible that an indigenous Fijian woman is leading an international organization. And I want to tell you I want to tell you and share with you that every time I make a decision, I can hear my grandmother. She knew systems very well. She knew relationships really well. My grandfather died in 1917, and the only reason we know our Kandava side is that Bumbu went to all the funerals, all up until Daddy was ready to take on. So that's what I mean by systems, institutions, and relationships of decision making. I don't make decisions because Oxfam has given all the policies. I don't make decisions from a profit-making perspective. I make decisions because we think of what's in the future. So you can't talk about self-determination and stewardship without talking about solidarity and safeguarding. I do not mean that we have to give up our tradition. I do not mean that we have to conserve tradition. All I'm saying is that we need to safeguard what matters for us in our identity, which has brought others along. I haven't been brought up to keep others away. I know I use that very loosely, but that's how it's possible for an Oxfam in the Pacific to exist today, because we have challenged an INGO to say that we might be 12 million in the Pacific, but we are custodians of the Pacific Ocean, and each country has indigenous people, indigenous women, who have been making decisions around their resources. So I want to acknowledge again the upbringing and the history that you have given us. Our role as an INGO is to listen, really listen, and ensure that we can make changes at other places and global levels. So again, thank you for this opportunity for us to be here today, to give more meaning and more substance to what it means for women to sit at the table and to contribute to the future that we all want to see. Naka.
Thank you, Rachel, for that address. We heard you and we hear you. You have put in front of us a number of challenges that we seldom think about as mothers and indigenous women. Sometimes we take our roles for granted. We are just mothers and wives, and then we are challenged when we don't go to the provincial council meeting or the Mbosivakor or all those things. But what you've reminded us of today is our responsibility. Our responsibility as stewards. And what was the other word you used? Safeguarding, our inheritance in this world. Very important. And that in doing so, the very thoughts that we own resources, we own land, those things have responsibility, and that we never ever take those things as belonging to us. It's for the future. We are merely custodians of our resources. And when we're dealing with our resources, we must always look at the future generations. Because what we do today with our resources will impact on the access of our future generations to those same very scarce resources. So thank you for reminding us that we need to be good custodians, and we need to have the view that our resources need to be shared and safeguarded for future generations. Thank you. There was no part in the program for a response. So I'm doing that at my own behest. And in doing so, I would like to, and we look forward to the next 3 days. I hope you facilitators of the discussions will bear those things in mind, and that it's not just Fiji, how we handle our resources in Fiji, our natural resources, but how it impacts on other countries. And in Fiji, we are lucky. If there's global warming, sea level rise on coastal areas, at least we can move inland. In other countries like Tuvalu and Kiribati and Nauru, they have nowhere to move. So always bear those. So I think it was a godsend that I met Rachel at another event. Yes. And then she offered to come and have a meeting here, and one day later they said, yes, we will fund your activity. And they sent all their staff to come and discuss the matter. So the next 3 days, ladies and gentlemen, is being funded by Oxfam. So give a round of applause for that. And lastly, I thank you again and thank Oxfam, and please convey our gratitude to your main organization, and that we hope you will continue. This is the beginning of our relationship, that we will continue to work together. So please, ladies, join me in the usual way. We show our appreciation.